Welcome.
Hi.
We are Moira Krzyzanowski, SLP.
I'm Rita Savasco, SLP. We're going to talk about grammar today.
Yeah, we are actually mother-daughter team, colleagues and family.
Yes.
And we work together with students who primarily struggle with reading and writing. So dyslexia, dysgraphia, but also expressive and receptive language delays.
Yes. So we're going to get started. And I just want to say that we know everybody's here. We only have an hour and we know everyone's here because you already know some of the research about why it's important to work on grammar. We're going to be talking about what we do when we work on grammar instead of giving you a lot of research about grammar. This is a lot about intervention today. Okay.
So this is our grammar that is functional. We're all about being functional, and we're working primarily at the sentence level.
Right.
And you'll see why that is as we move forward.
Okay, so just some disclosure statements. One is that we are a mother-daughter team, which I got to tell you is pretty cool to be an SLP and have a daughter who becomes an SLP and then work together in private practice. The private practice, the student samples you'll see are from our private practice. We have permission for all of these examples. And we also have an online business called Rooted in Language. And we create some materials and teach instructional classes there. And you will see, we'll be using one of those materials throughout this presentation.
You're also permitted to capture images from this session. Obviously, we cannot control that in this recorded format. So, pause and play at your leisure and snap some photos.
Yes, right.
We want your therapy to improve.
So one of the things I said before is we already know that grammar is integral to literacy. It affects our listening comprehension, our verbal expression. Most of us have learned a lot about that in terms of its syntax. It really impacts reading comprehension. We have so much great research about the degree to which grammar is impacting reading comprehension. What we find in working with students who have reading struggles is that ability to understand phrasing really impacts reading fluency. The next thing is, I think the thing we also see clearly is how much it influences written expression. We have kids who are creating very disorganized sentences and they don't know how to punctuate them. The sentence mechanics obviously are affected too. And then we also see some relationship between grammar and this ability to capture and use vocabulary and be flexible in vocabulary usage because of the grammatical relationships of words. And so we include a word study where you're looking at spelling and morphology and the word structure and how that, adding suffixes changes the grammatical structure. That's the derivations of a word. So these are all things we know about how integral grammar is in reading and writing.
And just to point out, we have research that we have cited and that we follow and that we use to fuel all the strategies. And we have some of that peppered in here, but for the most part, we're really focusing on your therapy and your strategies as much as we can today. So the references are here for you, but we're not going to dig into the studies so much. All right. So why do grammar? Because, and why work in the realm of reading and writing with grammar? If your grammar sounds good when you speak, do we need more of it? And the reality is, yeah, because text is so much more grammatically complex than our spoken language. You can certainly speak with complex grammatical structures, but boy, text is just a whole nother beast. It's so much more lexically dense. It has a lot of varied structures. You get these phrases that modify phrases that modify phrases that modify phrases that can be embedded within each other. You have sentences that are just really lengthy because there's many, many clauses within a single sentence. And then Rita already mentioned the derivations of words based on different suffixing that changes the grammatical usage of a word. And then, yeah, we have phrases that appear to be doing one thing because of the kinds of words that are in it that might actually functionally be doing something else, particularly phrases that seem verbish but aren't actually the verb of the sentence. These kinds of things all occur and confuse our students quite a bit.
Right. I wanted to include this sample. This is very typical for a student who has dyslexia. I want you to appreciate that handwriting. He actually had dysgraphia, and because we worked on cursive so much. His handwriting's amazing. So you will see, because of that, a lot of spelling errors here. So the elf treatment is when the main character and an elf fall in love with each other, but the elf reject the main character because she does not wrote instead of think, two different species,
Wrong
not
two.
the number two species, should fall in love with each other. So besides all of those typical dyslexia and spelling errors, you also see the way kind of students tend to kind of go on and on. Although this is a fairly organized sentence, certainly there are mechanical problems.
Right. It's a nice example, and you'll see many of why grammar work is impactful, or is impactful in students' writing. So what is the problem? What we need to do is explicitly teach foundational syntax grammar knowledge, right? And that is because the research has identified, and we've seen this truthfully play out in the students that we work with as well, is that really this identification, the source of the problem is that you have these kernels of a sentence, the subject and the verb, that students struggle to identify in these more grammatically complex sentences. They kind of can't find their way to those main kernel pieces, which is really what drives the whole meaning of the sentence. So we've got to teach them that subject and verb of the main clause, how to find that, right? Mm-hmm. And then what even is a clause, right? Let's be able to identify that so that we can find others, because we know sentences can have more than one. And then what's all this extra stuff? Because we know sentences, unless they're just the most simple sentence, subject, verb, maybe direct object or something, there's probably more there. And what's it doing? And what is its meaning? What does it add, right, to the sentence?
So we cite Tamborelli and Singer. They do a really good job. They present at ASHA frequently on grammar, and they have these nice questions they ask. Ironically, we left the question mark off of one of them in our grammar.
It's actually not a question, it's a statement.
So we ask kids, who or what is the sentence about? And then we identify that's a subject, and then what is the subject doing? And those kinds of questions really help drive what kids need to know. So we have this basic order of teaching, and it's totally based on function, not parts of speech. We don't do a lot of labeling of parts of speech. We get right to what do these things do in a sentence. So the first thing we teach that we just talked about is this subject and verb I was just referring to, most basic parts of speech. And then we teach some basic sentence types. So if you'll show those sentence types, that action verb, the subject plus action verb and direct object, that's very easy for kids, even language impaired kids. This subject plus linking verb plus subject complement, as long as the sentence structure is pretty simple. Most of our kids get that. The subject plus the helping verb plus a main verb, and then connecting to something. Okay. Again, as long as it's pretty basic, and we start out by teaching them these basic structures. Then we jump right to clauses. We get right to this idea that there can be a whole thought, as Singer and Tamborelli call it, or there can be half a thought, which is a dependent clause. And so we get right to this identification of which thoughts are whole thoughts, which thoughts are half thoughts. Then we start sorting out all the extra stuff, and we look at prepositional phrases.
Because kids use them a lot already.
Kids use them a lot already. They're pretty easy. They're the first one to layer on. And from there, we may talk about this sentence type where you have a linking verb to a locative complement. Like we're going to show you an example of that because they connect to place typically. And then we'll teach other phrases, and we group them together as verbals. We tell our kids they're verby looking words, but usually they act as giant describers. Sometimes they will act as nouns, but usually they're acting as giant describers. And so we talk about these verby looking words.
Okay, so we basically were trying to come up with a way, and we used lots of different sort of manipulative things to illustrate these grammatical forms and the jobs that these pieces that she just walked you through functionally take in sentences. And we eventually landed on creating this manipulative that we call grammar bugs, because it just does an amazing job actually illustrating the big enchilada that we were talking about. This, what is the sentence about? Who or what is the sentence about? The subject. And what is that subject doing? The verb. And that is illustrated here by the head of this kind of animated looking bug being the head of the sentence, what's driving all the decisions, right? What's driving everything in that sentence. And then the sort of body portion with the feet have that kind of actiony feel to it, being what the head is doing, what the subject is doing in the sentence. And then we have other manipulative pieces that could keep building on this metaphor, basically, for all the other structural elements of a sentence that we showed you through. And kind of the bugs just sort of kept growing from there. And it's a great illustration. Kids can really see visually what's going on with words and text. Something that's very hard to talk about because it's very metacognitive, really. So yeah, that's where the bugs came. So you can see here, the teaching the kind of main structures, those sort of main sentence types, is happening on this page via bugs.
And then we took the illustration further for these things that we're really trying to highlight for kids that are functional. So one is you really have to know what all your conjunctions are, and you need to know which ones are coordinating conjunctions and which one are subordinating conjunctions. And what we did is we put them on leaves. So we just kind of stuck with the bug theme. We put them on leaves. The kids know we have leaves. They sort leaves. They draw leaves out of boxes, whatever. And then we also wanted them to understand that this whole thing called a clause is either going to be independent or dependent. And so we created these long logs that our bugs can sit on. So this is an example of how we're showing this combination of two independent clauses together, or a dependent independent clause, okay?
And then when we talk about teaching phrases, this is the bug illustration for that. We are showing here two kind of the main types. We have that prepositional phrase here on the left and the verbal phrase on the right. This is an example of a participial phrase on the right. And we have the wings that illustrate, oh yeah, I'm sorry, I had those labels here, prepositional phrase and verbal phrase. And the wings illustrate that this is sort of side describing information. It's not part of that kernel body that builds the main bug itself, but they can be moved around to show which portion it is actually describing, right? So on both of these examples, they happen to be describing the verb,
which they often are.
Which they often are, and they're connected. But you could have a phrase that's describing a subject, so it would go on the head, or describing maybe an object or something else, so it's going, or a phrase on a phrase, which can happen as well.
Right. So the kids can actually move
things around.
Yep. Right. So we are always targeting grammar at 3 levels. We're working from sentences to paragraphs to papers, okay? But or essays, whatever you want to think of as these big final lots of writing projects, right? But we really teach these concepts at the sentence level, but then we help kids work them on into paragraphs and papers. But whenever we're analyzing their writing, we're always back to that sentence level again, right? So we teach concepts at the sentence level, and we realize that the sentence is where we can really show kids that the functional usage, it's how these parts of the sentence work together that actually conveys the message, that there may be connotations that are contextual, that they have to know these functions of the phrases and the clauses. They have to understand how to use punctuation, and that information can help them with that. And they really like knowing that. They have these kind of little rules they can follow. And we show them this impact when we're adding prefixes and suffixes or taking them off if they're trying to comprehend text.
Okay, so we're working from these manipulatives to text, and we have this sort of little quadrant thing here set up to show you how we're going to move through our examples. So when you're working on grammar, you've got to actually, we've said that it really impacts comprehension, and it really impacts composition and writing skills, and so therefore it must be explicitly practiced in both of those modes, for comprehension of text and in composing text. So we have 2 ways we do that for each of these modes. We practice in what we call off the page, which is when we're using manipulatives. We're getting it off of that piece of paper, right? Whether it's typed or written. And then what we call on the page is when we're actually working with text. So in reading, text that they're reading or text that they're writing for something for their own original output, right? And then in doing that, and doing this off the page and on the page work, what we're doing is we're really working on deep learning. And the more they can be dealing with it off the page, the successfully and getting in that repeated practice in that way that's much more manipulative. We know the research supports that kind of multisensory work really builds into deep learning. It's much more visual, and then getting it back on the page because they've got to be able to functionally use it in both reading and writing.
Right. So what we were kind of trying to do is, people will do these, sentence diagramming, and diagramming that didn't inherently have any real meaning. Like this line means this and this line means that. Our kids don't hold on to that information.
And it didn't have a lot of impact on their output.
Yeah, we weren't seeing any results from that. And we were just trying to use sticky notes. There were different colors, and then everybody had to track colors. So we started using things that just kind of inherently gets them there very quickly and lets them move it around and manipulate it.
Right. You'll see lots of examples of that. So this idea of the superordinate versus the subordinate is basically, it's kind of getting back to this problem, right, with the text that we're dealing with our students. So you're at a sentence level in both reading and writing. Students have to be able to identify what's called this superordinate idea. Basically, something within this sentence is more important than the rest of it, right? It's kind of the main message. And then you have all these subordinate ideas that are other things, right? That extra stuff that isn't unimportant. It's adding information that we're supposed to know, but it's not above the main message. We got to know what's driving everything, right? So students have to be able to monitor all of this information and in their brains be creating this kind of hierarchy as they read and as they compose, right? So that their sentences make sense and their comprehension is correct, right? So how do we help them do that? We have to teach and illustrate this combination of complex grammatical structures, i.e. clauses and phrases for the most part, right? Within the single sentence format, because that's really where it all begins.
Right. And that's what as a person with strong syntax skills can do normally. They can hold a main idea as a bucket. And because it's a bucket, all this other information can fit in that bucket very easily.
Side
right?
buckets.
Yeah. But for our kids, they can't even sort out what's the bucket, right? And that's really what we're going for. So the first thing we're going to look at is our examples of how we teach off the page with comprehension. Okay. So we take text that kids may be reading in school. This is a sentence from Animal Farm. Okay. Which is supposed to be middle school, early high school.
Yeah.
Usually it's about 8th, 9th grade. Okay. Amazed, terrified, huddling together, the animals watched the long line of pigs march slowly around the yard. Now, first of all, if I start with the question, who or what is this sentence about? A lot of my students will say pigs.
That's very common when a sentence has a lot of different nouns for them to move towards one that's closer to the end of the sentence, because it's one of the last things.
Well, it's the thing that's most visual too.
It kind of stands out.
It kind of jumps out at them. So then I say, well, okay, but in this sentence, what is the subject doing? So you could get marched or you could get watched. So I just want you to really appreciate here that in working with the student, once we get them to identify that it's really about watching pigs, watching this line of pigs, that we can then begin to sort through who or what is the sentence about, what is that subject doing, and they're watching what. Again, students would come back and say, well, they're watching pigs, and we would have to help them see, well, really they're watching a line of pigs. So this really comes down to a kernel sentence that they can understand. This is basically subject, action, verb, direct object. And that is an easy kernel for them to understand, but because of all this extra stuff, they can't even get to that kernel of the sentence, okay?
Okay, so we have an example here. Basically, a lot of what we're showing on this off-page work is taking text and mapping the structure of those sentences onto these bug forms to help it become visual and manipulative for them. So this is, we were using a children's book because children's books, while written for kids are written with the grammatical complexity that a parent can read to a child. So actually the sentences are often very appropriate for, middle, high school age kids even, in terms of their grammatical complexity. And it makes it a little bit more fun because there were some pictures. So he was practicing mapping some of these sentences for comprehension work, because this is a student who really struggled with comprehension, onto bugs. And you can see here, we have these bugs that become sort of like these monstrous looking things, right? Because we have a single subject there, dragon, that is doing multiple things. So he has a really long body, and each of those body parts has its own direct object coming off of it. So we get this monstrous bug that looks really crazy, but actually very easily illustrates what's going on in this sentence, right? The dragon smashed a castle, burned clothes, and carried off Prince Ronald. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped one. There we go. And this is a great example because it was she was a junior or a senior at the time I was working with her. We were using these bugs, which, you think they maybe look like they're for little kids, but here we are working on ACT, SAT sentences that she was having to answer grammar questions about for the English portion of the ACT. We were doing practice ACT passages, and they go through at a sentence level and say, tell me X, Y, and Z about this sentence. If she didn't understand these things, almost half the questions come down to clause knowledge and the mechanics that go with that. So what we were doing here is marking out on the bug so she could figure out what on earth was happening here and answer the question correctly. And you'll see we now have a bug that's illustrating this kind of ridiculous tale, but it has all one single subject and verb and multiple direct objects going on here.
Right. So we look at comprehension back in text again, what we call on the page. That's kind of our little nickname for it. So what we have here is another Animal Farm passage. Major's speech had given to the more intelligent animals on the farm a completely new outlook on life. So once we know kids can hold this visual structure in their head that we've taught them with our manipulatives, then we start teaching them how to mark text as they read. So one of the first things we have them decide is who or what is the sentence about, the subject, and they underline that. Okay. And again, some of this marking does come from Tamborelli and Singer. Some of it we've modified and created our own. You get kind of a combination here. Then we say, okay, so what is this speech doing? What is Major's speech doing? Okay. It seems a little weird when you have a what that's more conceptual like this to figure out what the verb is. Most kids would figure out that it's given is a verb, and then we might help them see, well, it's really had given.
Because it's not speech given,
so,
right?
So we direct them back to these images of the sentence types that they have in their notebooks. They have these images and bugs in their notebooks. And so we show them this subject plus helping verb plus main verb plus the rest, right? Okay. And so then from there, we realize, well, now it's turned into kind of this action verb kind of thing. And so we have to find a direct object. And to help them do that, we start bracketing off all the extra stuff to help them get it out of their way. So what we're doing here is we're bracketing off some of these phrases that is just extra stuff. And so now they're saying Major's speech had given what? And we help them get to the idea that it had given an outlook. And now you can already see, now our nouns are conceptual, which is much more difficult for our language impaired kids to understand. We do teach them that there are determiners, the a, and the, that tell them a noun is coming, a noun is coming. And we tell them that. And so we may cue them that they see something that tells us a noun is coming, what, and help them see outlook and outlook, right?
Yeah. Completely.
And we might draw arrows actually from all of those describing words over to outlook. So they get the idea like all those things are doing are describing the direct object. Right. But we've kind of gotten all the extra stuff out of the way so they can see what does this sentence say.
So these are some basics of a marking system that we use with students for comprehension.
Right.
Okay, so some more comprehension on the page might, if we're not marking with a kind of all of those pieces, our marking system, we might also be working on helping students just track generally what is being discussed? Like who or what is the main thing being discussed in a sentence? Because that can be very tricky when you get a lot of these complex competing information being embedded in, right? So I was pulling a sentence, I pulled a passage here, it's more than one sentence, from Johnny Tremaine that I was doing with a student who I think was like a sixth grader at the time. And this is a rough sixth grade read, but it is often read around that age.
Yeah.
Yes. You know, that older vernacular text. Kids still have to read it all the time, but it is grammatically difficult. So what we have here is an example of this first, it's like 3 sentences I have shown you, is actually not that hard for students to understand who this sentence is about, because it doesn't ever deviate from being about one person. Even though we're suddenly moving into using pronouns like he, they can easily track that all these he's refer to Johnny, because it doesn't move off from that. Johnny was already in his leather breeches, pulling on his coarse shirt, tucking in the tails. He was a rather skinny boy, neither large nor small, for 14. He had a thin, sleek, flushed face, light eyes, a wry mouth, and fair, lank hair, all describing Johnny. And what I did was I was highlighting all of the sort of pieces of the sentence that were referring back to Johnny.
And another reason they find it easily is the subject is exactly where they expect it to be.
Right.
It is, first of all, the beginning of the whole paragraph, it's Johnny, and then in the next sentence, it's he, right? And that's what our kids expect. So they don't have too much struggle with the sentence like
all 3, Johnny, he.
Oh yeah, there were 3.
And then I'm going to show you the very next sentence that comes, next couple sentences. Actually, this might all be one. It's one sentence, okay? And look how long it is. Although 2 years younger than the swinish dove, inches shorter, pounds lighter, he knew, and old Mr. LaFamme knew, and busy Mrs. LaFamme and her 4 daughters, and Dove and Dusty also knew that Johnny Tremaine was boss of the attic and almost of the house. And this sentence completely threw my student off from what on earth was being discussed here. He did not know that that sentence was still about Johnny. He was like throwing out all of the other names that come before we even get to Johnny Tremaine in that sentence, which doesn't come until the very end, right? We have a lot of subordinate information that comes first, but the hierarchy is actually Johnny Tremaine. In fact,
I think the independent clause there is
he knew,
yeah,
which is Johnny. That one I have in purple, right? Which he, though, because we have Dove, Dusty, Mr. LaFamme, we also have some women in there, Mrs. LaFamme, 4 daughters. Okay, so what we were doing is using highlighter colors to what we call kind of cohesive tie work to track what all is about our main, sentence driver, Johnny Tremaine here, and what was actually, we had a bunch of different colors, but each only showed up like once, right? That this whole thing was still actually about Johnny, even though it was all out of order. Okay, and now we're going to move on to some off the page work for composition. Writing is always fueling the reading work as well, just so you know. So honestly, when you're doing off the page composition work, you really are working on comprehension.
Right, and we actually move back and forth
Right,
between these more fluidly. We've kind of blocked them off in these nice little clean blocks for you, just to be able to follow some of the different strategies. But we would go back and forth between when we're doing off the page work, both in reading and
this is not linear.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
And we move on and off the page all the time.
Okay? And I also want to point out that anytime you're working on composition, you may be involved in some editing work going on,
because that's part of what grammar is about. Okay, so what you're seeing here is my writing, because I was working with this student online, so I took a screenshot of our Zoom screen. She was actually writing and filling in these same bugs at her house, and she had created a number of subjects, she had created a number of action verbs, and she had created a number of things that we could randomly pick up and create in order to do this new sentence type that we were working on. And we always start with this one because it's the most, it's the easiest for kids who have language delays. So she was creating subjects, action verbs, and direct objects. And if you notice, you end up getting some noun verb agreement in there, because I squirt is different than the verb that, the suffix form that we need to add, or the verb form to change the verb form when it's Piper squirts. Okay, so she was working on that as we were working on these the sentence types.
So she's building her own sentences here.
Yeah, she is too. Right. So what I had on my screen, she had on her table. Okay. So also, when we're reading text, this is from a short story, that we often will then put it, we'll have kids write summaries of text, and then we'll take their sentences and put them back on bugs again. So he had read a short story and he created this sentence: when the ant tells Nuttall that the men will soon be back, he gets nervous. Okay, he didn't really know how to punctuate this. He did actually, in fact, create this sentence all himself, which, believe me, he was very syntactically impaired. This was a fantastic sentence for him. And we really put it on the bugs to help him figure out what was going on, what needed to be punctuated.
Mechanics needed to be there. Yeah.
And this one, comments contribute to the plot by adding suspense to the story. And this was really just taking the students' writing and helping them see actually how complex their own writing is and how many phrases they're using, and, you know, kind of the way in which they organized it. So sometimes I actually take a really strong sentence they use, and I actually have them put it back on bugs so they can see what they did. Okay.
Which helps inform what they do next when they're trying to build more complex sentences.
Right. This was a really interesting one because the student had originally written in his journal, "I have been hunting since I was 6 with my dad." So what we did is we just, on the marker table, he's already done a lot of bug work, but we just started drawing up bug heads and bodies, if you can see that. And so we took out the phrase "with my dad," and he put in this sentence on his illustrated bug: "I have been hunting since I was 6. And then we drew a wing with my dad, and I said, "Where does this wing go?" And he realized "with my dad" really needs to go up by hunting. If you see, he drew a little wing there and an arrow, okay? And so now he's rewriting his sentence: "I have been hunting with my dad since I was 6. Now, we all know there are, I can make that kind of error, right? We all can do this in writing. And it was such a beautiful example of how putting it back on the page, he immediately saw it. I didn't even really have to comment.
Taking it off the page.
Or taking it off the page, sorry.
Well, and we show this example because it's kind of this hybrid sort of transition between being off the page to on the page, because this was a parent teacher who had used the bugs to help set up a clause and then showed the subordinating conjunction that leaves the question open to then spark that next original writing, which is kind of back on the page, right? So during the reign of Philip II, Spain became, I can't read this very well, a weaker empire because, and then the student can put the rest of that, their original writing, onto that bug. So it was showing the structure of how the sentence had been set up as opposed to being kind of back on the page where they're finishing it. So it was a nice combination.
Can you just go back to the prior one for a minute? I just want to comment. I rewrote his sentence at the top, but he is rewriting himself. I just want another plug for cursive. This is another child who struggled with dysgraphia.
Yeah. Always plugging cursive. It can really.
It is transformative for kids with dysgraphia. Just want to say.
We have a whole other presentation we're given about that.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so now we're moving on to composition on the page, which definitely always involves editing, and you will see some strategies for this.
Okay, so this one was mine. So I had a student, I was trying to, he had done some writing about a book he was reading, this in context writing on the right. And so I did a side lesson with him to get ready to edit his writing. And we did some practicing of dependent, independent structures. And I gave him the subordinating conjunction when, and gave him the model: when blank, comma, blank. Okay, now again, he and I are working online. So he has to mark his subjects and verbs. He underlined his subjects, he italicized his verbs. But he had to follow that format and create some sentences. So he had, when we are done, I might go to Kings Island with my sister. And then we were highlighting this relationship between using this subordinating conjunction of when and the comma and the period. And then he flipped that sentence around. He had chosen a sentence on the next one to try, actually was a phrase, not a dependent clause. So he had said at the end of the day, we're going to do an escape room. So we then turned that using when. When we go to the escape room, comma, it will be dark outside, okay? So kids, a lot of times, you know, they think they're making dependent clauses, they're actually making phrases. Then we tried it again in the other direction. We're going to the escape room. When it's dark outside, now I don't need a comma. Okay, then we went back to the writing he had done about the book he was reading. And this time I gave him two different subordinating conjunctions, since and even though. You're looking to the right side of the screen now. So since the original client died, Zhao Mingru, I didn't read this book, took over his dead body. Zhao Mingru took over his dead body since the original client died. Okay, and then even though Klein is in a coma, comma, people still worship him as a god. People still worship him as a god, even though Klein is in a coma. So, and then he would also have to identify this as dependent, comma, independent. It was just a good way to help him practice these sentences.
And what is this kind of practice achieving? It's helping students, A, get away from the simple sentence, right? They're writing like subject, verb, object, subject, verb, object, subject, verb, object. That's all they get. And also to help clean up writing that's complex, but all over the place and no one can follow what on earth you're saying when they're explicitly practicing these. And I wanted to say one more thing too, is that you had said kids often think they're creating a dependent clause, but instead they're creating phrase. And you might be thinking, well, how would they know that? Because we explicitly taught what is a clause and what is a phrase, like with manipulatives way before any of this kind of practice, right? So we can point out to them, well, if there's not a subject and a verb, it's not a clause.
And this same student just yesterday had to write a paper where he had to say what a character did. It was Riki Tiki Tembo. Can't remember exactly the name of that short story. But Riki, what Riki did and what it showed about his character. So he had to set up sentences literally that were, when Riki, blah, 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 it showed blah, 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 blah about his character. And this is not a one and done. I mean, we had done all this work and we were still really in the weeds on this. He had to show that relationship in his writing. A phrase wouldn't have done it.
So I'm going to show you some composition on the page strategy. This is basically sentence combining practice. And the value of sentence combining is it's helping take simple writing, helping kids work on getting those more complex sentences that have kind of more meat to them because there's some phrases, multiple clauses maybe. So this sentence, this student had read the book, I should have put the reference on the bottom, but it's the Golden Goblet. And
these are his words.
These are his words on the left. In what he had originally written, he was just basically writing summary sentences for what he had read in the chapter because he also struggles with comprehension. So Ranifer ponders what to do. How can Ranifer get Gabu in trouble? And then we worked on how can we turn that into one sentence, and he was using structures we had explicitly practiced a lot of this grammar and building bugs and all that stuff before, and these ones weren't that hard for him. He was able to combine that to Ranifer ponders how to get Gabu in trouble.
And can I just make a comment there? So he's supposed to be annotating text, and our kids are always just writing questions instead of writing an analysis of what's going on in text. So Moira also kind of was showing him how to turn that.
If it's a question, it's not a statement, it's not your opinion, right? Ranifer meets a mysterious person. This was interesting because I pulled two sentences he had written in two different spots on his Post-its as he was reading that were essentially about the same thing, but he'd kind of forgotten he'd already said this, right? Like Ranifer meets a mysterious person. And then a few pages later, Ranifer meets an old man by the Nile. It was like out of order. He was referring back to something he'd already read. So we can make this one sentence. We worked on combining it. Ranifer meets an old mysterious person by the Nile River, a little bit more complex because he's listing some describing words there. Things got a little, oops, my slide's not moving.
Really? Okay,
sorry
so
guys.
This. Okay, it's over here.
I gotta get it over here. Thank you. I don't know what happened. Okay, so then things got a little tricky when he had written the sentences on the left. Ranifer goes home. Ranifer confronts Gabu about the stealing. Gabu turns the blame on him. He beats him. These are sentences he had written, and we had grouped them together because we identified that they all were referring to the same scene, all right, in the book. But when he went to combine these, because of how he had written the individual sentences he came up with, Ranifer goes home and confronts Gabu about the stealing while beating him and turns the blame on him.
And he had Post-its of these, I think, or
Yes,
something.
yeah, post-its of his sentences.
Mhm.
And then I had the job of trying to help him see that what he combined was not saying what those individual sentences were saying. Now we have a more complex sentence, but it's also more confusing and incorrectly not saying what it's supposed to say.
He's
So
kind of just throwing a
he's
bunch of
throwing
notes
them all
in
together.
order.
Yeah, right. And also we had an issue, and we had discussed this. One of the things we got to look for is when we have two characters, especially of the same gender, that could both be him. Now we have these hymns, and which hymn is this hymn and which hymn is that hymn? So we have confusion there as well. So here's our, sorry, the student original, and then this was his original combined effort. All right, and then here on the left, we have some editing hierarchy work. So remember I told you about that superordinate and subordinate and how we have to help students work through and organize that kind of information. That is what we're doing here in the editing. So I have his original combined at the top again. He goes home, Brannifer goes home and confronts Gabu about the stealing while beating him and turns the blame on him. Okay, and what we did is we identified the main superordinate clause, which was that Brannifer goes home, right? Okay, and then we used this sort of almost like outlining, right? And we indented in all the next kind of phrasal information, that because we never had a new subject be introduced, because we didn't have, he knows the forms of clauses, we didn't ever have a whole new clause, that all must be referring to Rannifer. So Rannifer goes home and he's confronting Gabu about the stealing, and while beating him is also Rannifer beating someone, and turning the blame is also Rannifer. And then when I discussed that with him, he was like, well, wait, those two things aren't Rannifer. That's not who did that. So we ended up reusing our hierarchy and our indentation to show who does what. Rannifer goes home and confronts Gabu. That is still Rannifer about the stealing. But now we need a new subject. Gabu turns the blame on Rannifer. We put in a name instead of a him to help clear it up, while beating him is now referring to Gabu. Okay, and so that ended up being his final, but we couldn't do that until we were establishing hierarchy.
And again, though, we've already established too, when we're talking about a subject, what's a subject? When we're talking about we need a conjunction there, like but, what is that?
This is the kind of work that comes after lots of explicit teaching of these structures,
right?
And practice.
So he already could, and we refer back to those images when needed. So in truth, we go back and forth. Yeah. Okay, so this next one is a student of mine. This is going to be our last big example. To me, this just kind of throws it all together, because what we have here is a student who's very dyslexic. He has dysgraphia, so typing is also hard for him. He does not monitor what he writes well. He doesn't notice when the cursor's in the wrong place when he wants to modify something. He ends up with very confused text. His rereading is very poor, so he doesn't
rereads
notice
what he thought he wrote.
He rereads what he thinks is there instead of what is actually there. And he has weak grammar. Okay, so he
very smart kid.
Very smart kid. Yes. Yeah. He was writing a narrative. Oh, and on top of it all, he's supposed to be imitating mentor text, which we all know is great if you already have so much grammar skill, and really hard if you don't. So he's imitating a narrative style that he's been studying, and it is about a relay race from when he was in 6th grade. He is now in 9th grade. And he wrote, me being a strategist, I was, so that I would go on the back so that we could win really fast once we got to the end. Slowly but surely, our team gained as more and more of us were able to sprint back with her shoes on, instead of there. One by one, the other teams were left behind as we only had 3 people left. Okay, so that is his sentence.
Just want that to sink in, that piece of writing there.
And so obviously, my number one thing is helping this student order his thoughts and add these layers of narrative style and extra information that he was trying to put in there. Okay, so the first thing we did,
we have kind of steps for you.
We have steps, and again, we were working online. So the first thing we did is we decided, I had him decide what were some of the key things he was trying to say. Okay, and he highlighted this key thing, and then he told me in his own words what his point was with that. And I typed that on the right for him in a little box like you see. So strategist, he wanted to say, I had a strategy. So notice how I'm having him now kind of go back to these simple subject, action,
Messages.
verbs. Yeah,
Right.
these simple messages. On the back, I wanted to go on the back. It was, he said, well, I wanted to win.
Well, he
So
said,
then I
wanted-
helped him clarify that he was actually saying he wanted to run last. He wanted to be the anchor. Okay. And why did he want to go on the back? And then he begins to say, well, I wanted to win, be fast, and I knew I would be faster than the others on the team. Okay. So we're getting clear sentences here. And then the team gained. What does that mean? Well, we started to pull ahead of the other teams. Okay. And then he adds, we left them in the dust. Okay. And I was like, that was a nice thing to say. He ended up tossing it out later, but still, teams were left behind. Well, we were ahead. 3 people left. Well, that meant there were only 3 more people on my team left to run in the race. So I kind of had to help him with that one. That was a joint effort, having him really clearly state what he was trying to say.
and this is also not uncommon too, this greater ability to clarify verbally than in writing it.
Sure. Yeah. I mean,
all
we're
over.
back to the verbal, and also we're back to simple messages,
Right.
which he needed to do. So then with that in front of him, okay,
We're going back to sentence level now.
right. So now I went back to this first sentence. Okay. So, and I took those first ideas that went with these first sentences, and I asked him the question. So who is the sentence about? It's about myself. What's the subject doing? He says, well, I'm going last. Okay. And then I said, but what was your main message? And he said, well, I wanted to run last. And so he clarified. Okay. I wanted to run last. So we got that sentence. That's what he was trying to say. So what I'm really doing here is I was helping him get to that hierarchy, right? In his own writing. What is, you know, the
Main driver.
superordinate,
Yeah,
right? I
obviously.
wanted to run last. It was in the race. I wanted to run last. The whole theme that he was writing about is how he's super competitive. Okay. And so he didn't even, you know, we always talk about, do kids show their theme? Well, he's like, it's in there, but it's buried. Okay. So I wanted to run last. So we kind of take that phrase now. I wanted to run last. And then I said, yeah, clause, sorry. Clause. It has a subject and a verb. It's a clause. Thank you, Mark. This independent clause. I wanted to run last. And I said, okay, so now you know there are all this extra describing phrases in here, all this extra stuff. And so we're going to bracket that, and we're going to look at what are these extra things you wanted to say. So what does strategist describe? Me again, the subject. Okay. So what does on the back mean again? Going last. Okay. So what is, so that we could win describe? The reason I wanted to go last. So he's really starting to get to what he's trying to say here. And what is really fast describe? The way we'll win. And then, and these are his answers. Okay. I literally like recorded all this. And then what does, once we got to the end describe, he was like, well, I kind of feel like I already said that. This is like hard to say. And then that kind of led to, so do we really need this extra piece of information? Sometimes kids are like, oh, I just have to write one more thing. So I just said the same thing over again, right? So that helped us kind of get that out of the way. So then taking those pieces that he decided were essential to what he was trying to say, he created the sentence you see below. As a strategist, I had a plan to win. I was faster. And by the way, I really had to help him with it. As a strategist, he had to make sure he said who the subject was then. Okay. I was faster than most of my teammates, so I made sure I would go last. We started to pull ahead of the other teams, having had only 3 people left to go. Now, just so you know, he used then instead of than. He missed a comma. He didn't put a period on the end. The last sentence is a little awkward. Who cares? That is not my goal at this point. I would work on that back off the page again. My goal on this was to really get him organized.
And that kind of leads to the whole point of everything we're showing here, right? Are we trying to have students write perfectly when they bring us something messy? No, right? Because what often happens in intervention these days is kids bring us stuff and we feel this pressure to help them get a better grade. And then we're like, just say this, just write this, this needs to be this. Okay, now it looks so much better because it was mess before. And they've missed all of the opportunity for the process for them to learn any skills that become independent skills for them to be able to apply, so that next time maybe the writing they bring you is just a little bit clearer, right? It might not be perfect. This is a process that all of us go through. For struggling learners, it takes so much longer and goes so much further.
Right. And, you know, in truth, we only had time really to fix a paragraph of that whole paper. And I'm in communication with the teacher. Just so you know, this whole paper reflects what his writing really is. This paragraph reflects the foundational work we're doing in therapy. Okay. That is what it looks highly supported. But I don't want to just help him fix a paper, and I want him to really learn. Right. So that's the goal.
That is the goal. And so how do we get there? It's this visible teaching and learning by teachers and students that makes that difference. And it really, really, especially when it comes to grammar, but really any of these linguistic things we're working on with kids, need to be as visible as possible for them to be able to get that deep learning, that deep understanding.
And by the way, Hattie and Donahue did this meta-analysis on what was deep learning and what really made the biggest impact on kids' improved skills. And so that is a quote from his meta-analysis.
Right. We are a part of this larger company that Rita started called Rooted in Language. And if you know, this is presentation, we only had an hour, so we're kind of flying through some stuff. We didn't take you through all the teaching process, right? We do have that available for you, and so you can visit us for more information there.
Also, we wanted to show
we
you
have our two other team members.
Yeah, our two other team members who are, you know, some of the artists, organizers, creators, and
designers.
And Claire also does. She's not SLP. She does reading and writing tutoring, and she helps us put together our ideas as well. So we wanted to credit them for this.
And then some of our research references here, and a cute student.
Using her bugs. So thank you for joining us. We can go back to
I can stop sharing. So we did.
So thank you for joining us. I can't believe, I think we made it in our hour.
We
very
did.
Close to it, Maura, which was amazing.
Amazing for us.
As you can imagine, that a lot of these students we showed you, we've been working with for years.
Right.
And you know, I do think that continuity is an advantage we have here in private practice that you don't always have in a school. But when you can have continuity between therapists going from year to year, and even sharing strategies with teachers so they can understand the continuity of what's being taught, I think is really, really important for this grammar work. So any way you can impact that in your environment, I think it would be really helpful.
Yeah, and we'd love for you to email us, what you can do through our website if you have questions.
Yes, we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye. My mouse.
Get back over here. Here we go.